This is a history of one of the most contested conflicts in the modern world. It spans more than a century, involves competing claims to the same land, and means something different depending on who is telling it. This video lays out documented events in order without declaring a side. Part 1 covers the roots of the conflict through the War of 1948. For most of recorded history, the region called Palestine sat at a crossroads of empires. Canaanites, Israelites, Romans, Arabs, Crusaders, and Ottomans each governed it in turn. By the late 1800s, under 4 centuries of Ottoman rule, the population was majority Arab, both Muslim and Christian, alongside a smaller Jewish community that had lived there continuously for generations. 2 movements emerged in this century that would shape everything after. Arab nationalism grew across the Ottoman Empire, seeking self-rule for Arab peoples, and in Europe, a movement called Zionism emerged, calling for a Jewish homeland in this land, largely in response to centuries of persecution and rising anti-Semitism, including violent pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased gradually starting in the 1880s, organized in waves historians call Aliyah. Immigrants purchased land, often from absentee landlords, and established agricultural settlements. Arab residents, some of whom were tenant farmers displaced by these land sales, grew increasingly wary of the scale of immigration and its long-term implications for the region's demographic and political future. World War I reshaped everything. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Britain, during the war, made competing promises to different parties, including assurances to Arab leaders of support for independence in exchange for revolt against the Ottomans, and separately, the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which expressed British support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, while stating that the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be prejudiced. These overlapping wartime commitments are still debated by historians today. After the war, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate to govern Palestine. Jewish immigration continued, accelerating sharply in the 1930s as Nazi persecution intensified in Europe. Arab opposition grew alongside it, culminating in the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a large-scale uprising against British rule and Jewish immigration, which Britain suppressed. In response, Britain issued a white paper in 1939, sharply limiting further Jewish immigration, just as Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust had nowhere else to turn. By 1947, Britain, exhausted by the mandate and unable to reconcile the two communities' demands, handed the issue to the newly formed United Nations. The UN proposed a partition plan, dividing Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem placed under international administration due to its significance to multiple religions. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan despite reservations about its borders. Arab leadership, both in Palestine and across neighboring states, rejected it, viewing the partition as unjust since Jews at the time made up roughly a third of the population but were allotted more than half the land under the proposal. Civil war broke out immediately between Jewish and Arab communities within Palestine. Then in May 1948, as the British mandate ended, Jewish leaders declared the independent state of Israel. The next day, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded. The war that followed lasted into 1949. Israel, better organized and armed than expected, not only held its declared territory, but expanded beyond the UN partition lines. By the armistice agreements, Israel controlled about 77% of former mandatory Palestine. Jordan controlled the West Bank, and Egypt controlled Gaza. During and after this war, somewhere between 600,000 and 750,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes, becoming refugees in neighboring countries and the territories that remained outside Israeli control. Palestinians call this event the Nakba, meaning catastrophe, and it remains central to Palestinian national identity today. Israel disputes the characterization of a coordinated expulsion, citing wartime chaos and in some cases orders from Arab leaders for residents to temporarily evacuate. In the years following, roughly 700 to 800,000 Jews living in Arab countries across the Middle East and North Africa emigrated or were expelled, the majority resettling in the new state of Israel. By 1949, the war had ended, Israel existed, no Palestinian state had been established, and hundreds of thousands on both sides had lost their homes or countries. Part 2 continues from here through the 1967 war and into the conflict as it exists today. This next part picks up in 1967, nearly 2 decades after Israel's founding, and follows the conflict through to the present day. By the mid-1960s, tensions between Israel and its neighbors were rising again, fueled by border skirmishes, rhetoric from Arab leaders calling for Israel's destruction, and Egypt's decision to close the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping and expel UN peacekeepers from the Sinai. In June 1967, Israel launched preemptive strikes against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The resulting six-day war ended in a decisive Israeli victory. Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. This began a military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza that in evolving forms continues today. Israel later annexed East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, moves not recognized by most of the international community. Shortly after the war, Arab League states adopted the Khartoum Resolution, declaring no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel, a position that hardened the standoff for years. In the years after 1967, Israel began establishing civilian settlements in the West Bank. Most of the international community considers these settlements a violation of international law under the Fourth Geneva Convention, which restricts an occupying power from transferring its population into occupied territory. Israel disputes this, citing historical ties to the land and arguing the territory's legal status remains unsettled. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, hoping to reclaim lost territory. Israel repelled the attack after early losses. The war's aftermath opened the door to diplomacy. In 1978, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accords, and Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for peace, the first such agreement between Israel and an Arab state. Palestinian national identity and organization grew stronger through this period, centered around the Palestine Liberation Organization led by Yasser Arafat. The First Intifada, a widespread Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation, began in 1987 and lasted roughly 5 years, involving mass protests, strikes, and violence on both sides. In 1993, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators signed the Oslo Accords, a landmark agreement establishing the Palestinian Authority for limited self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and laying out a framework for further negotiations toward a permanent settlement. It was meant as a starting point, not a final resolution, and core issues including borders, Jerusalem, settlements, and Palestinian refugees' right of return remained unresolved. Negotiations continued through the 1990s, but repeatedly stalled. In 2000, a summit at Camp David between Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Arafat, hosted by President Clinton, failed, with each side blaming the other. Later that year, the Second Intifada began, a much deadlier uprising lasting until roughly 2005, including suicide bombings and heavy Israeli military response. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew all settlers and troops from Gaza. In 2006, Hamas, an Islamist movement that does not recognize Israel's right to exist, won Palestinian legislative elections. In 2007, after a violent conflict with the rival Fatah party, Hamas took full control of Gaza while Fatah continued governing the West Bank through the Palestinian Authority. Gaza and the West Bank have been governed separately ever since. Following Hamas's takeover, Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza, which Israel states is necessary to prevent weapons smuggling, and which the UN and human rights organizations have described as collective punishment. Since 2007, Israel and Hamas have fought multiple wars, including major escalations in 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and the large-scale war beginning after Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attack, which killed roughly 1,200 Israelis and took hundreds of hostages, followed by an Israeli military campaign in Gaza that has killed tens of thousands according to Gaza health officials and caused a severe humanitarian crisis. Throughout this period, West Bank settlement expansion continued, later peace efforts failed to produce a final agreement, and no independent, internationally recognized Palestinian state has been established. There is no agreed ending to this story because it hasn't ended. Israelis and Palestinians each carry their own history of displacement, loss, and claim to the same land, shaped by different chapters of the same 100 years. Understanding one side's account does not require rejecting the others, and the facts laid out here are a starting point for further understanding, not a final word on one of the most contested conflicts in the modern world.